Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to hearing number 30.8, which is rezoning requests for the Eastern Selwyn commercial and industrial area. And just before we commence, if anyone's watching us on YouTube, the video is broken, but you'll be able to hear us. So hopefully you'll cope with that. And just before we hear from our first submitter this morning, anything for us from the 42A reporting officers team?
No, I think that I covered it all in the pre-hearing memo, and apologies for missing off subrec 3. And as far as I know, that's been circulated to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. There's been, your addenda have been circulated, so that's great. Thank you. All right, our first submitter this morning is West Melton 3. Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for coming in. We've read the legal submissions and also Mr. Thompson, your planning evidence, so you don't need to read any of that out loud to us. But of course, as before in previous hearings, you're very welcome to highlight key points or present a summary to us, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine Forward. Now, I haven't appeared before you. Actually, I have appeared before you in the urban growth hearing some time ago, but the last time was remotely, so it's nice to be here today. To my left is Mr. Thompson, who you'll be very familiar with, who's provided the planning inputs for this submitter. This submission seeks to rezone the existing West Melton Tavern site. It's 1.2 hectares from general rural inner plains to local centre zone in West Melton. The site is located at the intersection of State Highway 73 and West Melton Road and comprises the tavern, a liquor store and a large area of car parking. The site's currently underutilised, particularly given its boundary with existing and established community facilities, the skate park, community centre and the council reserve. The proposed plan is notified included an existing local centre zone, but made no provision for growth. As the panel will be aware, all Selwyn townships are experiencing unprecedented growth in residential development, and West Melton's no exception. There is one other submission directly adjacent to the site across the state highway that seeks to rezone the existing BP site and a portion of the neighbouring residentially zoned land, 21 and 23 Corridor Lane, also to be local centre zone. I acknowledge the addendum to the Section 42A report, which is now approving that submission be accepted in part. What's important for the panel to note is that neither of these submissions, West Melton 3's or the Henderson submission for the BP site, alone will suffice to meet the shortfall in demand for additional retail and service floor space over the life of this plan. And this conclusion is agreed between the expert economic witnesses for both West Melton and the council. West Melton 3 Limited, sorry, and the council. The evidence presented in support of this rezoning proposal establishes that extension of the site as a small, centrally located commercial node will contribute a cohesive and well-integrated addition to the existing West Melton Town Centre. The evidence presented is largely non-contentious and undisputed, and except for Mr. Thompson, attendances for all other technical witnesses have been excused today. I know you've pre-read my submissions. I won't go over those. There's just a couple of matters that remain in contention. One being the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land considerations relevant to the site, and the second as a result of the addendum to the Section 42A report, whether there's a need following from a comment from the Council's urban designer, Mr. Nicholson, for an outline development plan and or a staged approach for the site. With respect to the NPS HPL, regardless of whether the panel accepts our written submissions relating to the applicability of the NPS HPL to the site, or whether the site meets one of the exemptions in clause 3.57b or 310, the evidence presented squarely confirms that this rezoning proposal meets the substantive NPS HPL test under clause 3.6. Table attached to Mr. Thompson's rebuttal evidence helpfully steps through the relevant assessment. Mr. Mathamo's report appended to the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Thompson records that the site is unproductive, the potential reduction in LUC 3 land is insignificant, and as the site does not form a cohesive area with other LUC 3 land beyond the site, it cannot be considered highly productive land. The 10 March addendum report records that Mr. Mathamo's evidence is new, has not been peer reviewed, and without that, the council officer is unwilling to revise her view to support the rezoning proposal. This view is maintained despite an acknowledgement that but for the NPS HPL threshold test being met, the site is suitable for rezoning and commercial development. With respect, I do not consider that a peer review of Mr. Mathamo's soil assessment is required. His assessment isn't controversial. It's highly unlikely that a peer review author will reach a different conclusion, that a 1.2 hectare block of land accommodating an existing tavern and extensive car parking can be put to a productive use in central West Melton amidst community recreation and residential activity on all sides. Further, I understand that this panel has confirmed on a number of occasions that it will be deciding submissions based on the evidence before it. Presently, Mr. Mathamo's report is the best evidence available, and my submission can be relied upon. Regarding the council officer's concerns that Mr. Mathamo's evidence is new evidence, I note that there were no further submissions in relation to this rezoning proposal, and therefore in my submission there is no prejudice to any parties with the panel accepting Mr. Mathamo's evidence by way of rebuttal. In fact, I recall that the panel actually directed that any gap filling evidence with respect to MPSL should come in via rebuttal evidence. I think that was minute 29. It's important to refer to Mr. Foy's summary statement of position economics appended to the 10 March addendum report. In this statement, Mr. Foy peer reviews the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Thompson for West Welsham 3 Limited and sets out his revised position. Support for both submissions that seek local centre zone to be approved, and that view is based on stronger growth projections equating to additional residential demand, which in turn supports a large area of local centre zone in West Melton. The next issue is the ODP and or a staged approach to development of the site. Mr. Nicholson, in his peer review of the rebuttal evidence for this submitter, voices concern that there's no requirement for a concept plan, which was incorporated within Ms. Lowenstein's evidence for this submitter, to be implemented should the rezoning proceed. He considers that the 1.2 hectare site ought to be subject to an ODP to specify key matters to be delivered as part of any development. Both Mr. Thompson and Ms. Lowenstein for West Melton 3 Limited agree that an ODP is helpful to create certainty that particular urban outcomes will be achieved. However, in this case, it's submitted that the rule package is sufficient to guide development, particularly due to the site's frontages with both the State Highway and West Melton Road and the council reserve land to the south. That said, should the panel consider an ODP is necessary, this can be prepared. Lastly, Mr. Nicholson's recommendation to stage development of the site appears to respond to Mr. Foy's original view that rezoning both this site and the BP site across the road may result in an oversupply of local centre zone land in West Melton. As this is no longer Mr. Foy's view, it follows that Mr. Nicholson's concerns should be disregarded and controls on staging development in my submission are unnecessary. The site will inevitably be developed in response to demand, and as Mr. Foy points out, more centre land will promote a competitive land market and increase the likelihood that additional centre space is actually developed, not land banked, and would enable a broader range of activities to establish on centre zone land in West Melton. And that's a segment from his summary statement in the 42 addendum. That's everything I wish to cover. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much for that. I'll see if we do have questions for you, Raymond.
No, I don't. I'm quite clear about everything. We've had a lot of West Melton information about West Melton 3, so I'm clear on everything. Thank you.
Andrew? Nicole?
No questions.
So I just got a couple of questions, and I don't mind if either you or Mr. Thompson answer them. I'm relaxed about that. So Ms. Lowenstein, in her original evidence, she had a concept plan. It was on page 12 of her evidence, and yes. I think you referred to that. Is that like a hypothetical kind of scenario, or is that what we would likely see developed on the site, do you think?
Might just check, are you referring to the sketch concept plan?
Yeah, it was a sketch that
yeah.
Purple and blue and the landscaping shown.
Yeah, look, it is a concept plan. It's not set in stone. We do accept that there is room for movement within that design plan, but largely that is what is the best presentation for the site in terms of development.
Yeah. So, without sticking precisely to the details, that's the type of development we might see
is.
on that site. Okay.
Would you agree, Mr. Thompson?
Yes, and it also shows some linkages as well to the surrounding recreational land.
Okay. And just a couple of questions about the site itself. So I just want to confirm. So to the south of the site, that's the council reserve.
It
Yep.
is.
And to the west, is that the
Community
skate park?
centre and the skate park.
And currently the site predominantly covered by the tavern and looks like a gravel car park. And the grassy area, that's just mowing, is it? It's not used for any kind of grazing or anything?
No, it's just bare land.
It's currently used for Fulton Hogan to store their machinery on while they're doing the
Okay.
intersection improvements.
And whilst the car park is gravel, it's been used as such for a very long period
Yeah.
of time, so it will have been compacted.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Now that's the only questions I had. Thank you. So, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you.
No, I've got nothing to add, actually. What do we
Sorry,
can sell, basically. Probably a comment on the staging. It's covered, but I mean, just to reinforce what Ms. Forward just said, for commercial zonings, your staging is normally to try and avoid what's called distributional effects. And there's normally large shopping centres which have a staging program, but there's been no modelling, been no evidence given on whether there's been any distributional effects that will arise from this particular shopping centre. So, I mean, the staging from that point of view is unnecessary. The second point about staging as well, it's probably in my view, it'd be contrary to the general tenor of the NPS UD, which really is there to enable at least sufficient capacity. So the idea of staging something to just meet a need at a certain point of time is not really part of that document. So yeah, for two reasons, I wouldn't agree with Mr. Nicholson on that particular matter. But I can see his this point with the ODP. I sort of don't think one's necessary, but I can understand he may have one or two concerns about the connectivity being guaranteed. So other than that, no, I've got really nothing. Oh, there's probably one other thing. I don't know whether this is a professional matter or a matter of the panel, but in my evidence on the NPL, which you may or may not have read, I pointed to a couple of issues that may arise for the council in dealing with the NPS NPL and its administration. The HPL, beg your pardon, NPL, got 70, sorry, HPL. And one of them is, when do you decide when something is actually worth pursuing in terms of that particular document? And and when a planner can make a decision on whether something is constrained and when you need soil experts to do it, because it is quite an extra cost to get an expert in to, in my opinion, in this case, to actually say something which was pretty obvious. And the reason I raise is because I've got there are probably one or two other instances which will come up where the sites are very small, but they're class, they're HPL. They're yeah, and so just whether there's a trigger point or some guidance when a submitter needs to go and get expert evidence on soils to demonstrate something which is probably constrained in terms of that document.
Yeah, we can't give you any specific guidance there, but I would think in this case it would be a prime example where soil expert evidence would be superfluous. I mean, this site is surrounded by a skate park, a council reserve and roads, and it clearly hasn't been used for productive purposes for quite some time and probably never would be. So, in colloquial terms, this one might be a no-brainer, but in terms of other sites, I mean, each is on its merits, isn't it?
I know. I understand the planner's conundrum, or the council's or the panel's conundrum here as well. So, yeah, it's just a point with the NPS HPL itself. It's sometimes not helpful, I don't think.
I understand it's tricky for everyone.
Yep.
Any questions, Jane, Mr. Thompson, Andrew, Nicole? No, I've no questions either, but look, in terms, you've said to us that if an ODP was required, then one could be prepared. And we haven't discussed this as a panel, but I don't see the need for that myself. And certainly in terms of staging, I'm personally relaxed about not having to specify that as well. But if as a panel we decide we do need an ODP, we'll come back to you through the hearing secretary. All right, but thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thanks.
So now we're adjourned until 10:30 or thereabouts for our next submittal. 10:45.
I've
Testing, testing.
Well, good morning, everyone. Resume hearing of submissions for hearing number 30.8. Rezoning submissions relating to the Eastern Selwyn commercial and industrial part of the district. And at this stage, we're hearing from Gulf Central Properties and Apton Developments Limited. Good morning and welcome. I think you've appeared before us before, but I'll repeat my spiel. Thanks very much for the pre-circulated material, both evidence and legal submissions. We've read that, so you don't need to read that out loud to us. But Ms. Everly, yourself and your witnesses are very welcome as usual to highlight key points for us or to present summaries, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Thank you. So this submission relates to the land adjacent to State Highway 1 Main South Road. It's a long, narrow area of land, also bounded by Jones Road and the railway to the west, Dawson's Road to the north, and Curra's Road to the south. The site currently contains a farm machinery sales business, a dwelling, a stand of pine trees, and a go-kart track. The submission originally sought rezoning of a larger area of land to general industrial. That submission's been refined to retention of the rural general zone with the addition of a rural industry precinct overlay. Within the precinct, rural industry and rural precinct activity is permitted. Rural precinct activity is a new definition proposed. It's a business undertaken in a rural environment that directly services a rural production activity and/or has a functional or operational need to locate in the rural precinct overlay. The officer's report initially recommended that the submission be rejected on the basis that it doesn't give effect to the RPS direction for activities outside of the urban boundary. That issue is addressed in my written submissions. The definition of rural precinct activity is consistent with the definition of rural activities in the RPS and takes its wording directly from the proposed district plan policies in the rural zone, policies 4 and 5. And we understand that the officer is now satisfied on that issue. The remaining concern set out in the officer's memorandum of 10 March relates to soils evidence and the application of the MPS HPL. The rebuttal evidence for the submitter includes the evidence of Sian Hainsworth as to soil classification and Stuart Ford as to rural production economics and the MPS HPL considerations. A peer review of Mr. Ford's evidence has been provided by Derek Foy for the council. Mr. Foy accepts the evidence of Mr. Ford and now supports the relief sought without qualification as to the NPS HPL. The officer concludes that Mr. Foy supports the development if the land is exempt from the NPS HPL. However, legal advice to the council is that the land is in the general rural zone, land in the general rural zone and the plains is subject to the MPS HPL. The officer also signals that a peer review of the new evidence by Mr. Hainsworth is required and concludes that the issue related to highly productive land is unresolved. In my submission, that conflates two issues to be considered under the MPS HPL. The first is whether the land falls within the interim definition of highly productive land. I disagree with the legal opinion provided to the council and I've addressed the reasons for that in my written submissions. However, if the panel doesn't accept that submission and concludes that the site does fall within the interim definition of highly productive land, the second consideration is whether the site satisfies the clause 3.10 exemption for highly productive land subject to long-term constraints. The evidence of Mr. Ford accepted by Mr. Foy is that it does. Accordingly, evidence, even if the site does contain highly productive land, the relief satisfies the MPS HPL. In terms of Mr. Hainsworth's evidence, that relates to soil classification. In my submission, his evidence is not controversial, concluding that 8.5 hectares of the site is LUC 2 or 3. His conclusions are largely consistent with the New Zealand Land Resource Inventory maps, and whether you accept Mr. Hainsworth's evidence or rely on the NZLRI mapping doesn't alter the conclusion that clause 3.10 exemption is met. Accordingly, no peer review of Mr. Hainsworth's evidence is required in order to accept the relief sought. Rules are proposed to address management of specific effects. Of most note are the provisions in relation to transport management. The submitter accepts the latest proposals in the transport peer review appended to the 10 March memorandum. Draft rules are provided in relation to realignment of the Jones and Dawson's Road intersection, although I understand from Mr. Leckie, who has just driven past the site, that that upgrade is already completed, and installation of a centre median on Dawson's Road, as well as retention of sightlines to State Highway 1. I'm mindful that there are various amendments to rules across a number of statements of evidence, and so we've produced a collated set of our final provisions. So I'll ask Mr. Hansby to pass those around now, or I can provide them to you electronically as well. So in terms of the witnesses available to today, Mr. Ford is online, Mr. Leckie and Mr. Thompson are here. I understand you don't have any questions for Mr. Craig, and we also don't have Mr. Tish here, but he can answer any questions that you have in writing. I was expecting Mr. Hainsworth. I see he's not online, so perhaps if he doesn't arrive, any questions could be put to him in writing as well. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just see if we have any questions for you. Raymond, any questions for council? Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just the one question. So just for clarification, so in paragraph 22, you refer in your legal submission, you refer to the Adderley Head opinion. And you've addressed the ODP, which I understand is probably the operative district plan. Is there a need to also consider the proposed district plan?
In my submission, there's not, because the interim definition talks about the zoning of the land, and the current zoning of the land is through the operative district plan.
Okay, yep, I understand that. Thank you. No further questions.
Nicole? I just want to walk through with you a discussion about the NPS highly productive land. And I'll address it to you because it's about interpretation issues, so legal issues. But if Mr. Thompson has a view, he's welcome to chip in. So I've been wondering myself whether or not the NPS highly productive land is engaged or not. And so I thought, go back to first principles. So let's look at the definitions. And so I'll walk through this slowly with you. I looked at the definition of urban, and a precinct is not included within the definition of urban. It talks about zones, including a special purpose zone, but that's not what you're suggesting here. You're suggesting a precinct, which is different. So in my mind, that's not within the NPS highly productive land definition of urban. Therefore, it's not urban rezoning. So on that basis, clause 3.6 is not engaged because we're not looking at an urban rezoning.
Right.
Right. So that's step one. So then we look at other parts of the NPS highly productive land. And it's from the MFE guidance document, it's clear that section or clause 3.9 is only engaged in relation to decisions on land use consent applications. That's in table 1 of the MFE guidance document, but we're not dealing with one of those here. Which then brings us to clause 3.10, but it seems to me that clause 3.10 is only engaged if we're looking at rezoning to rural lifestyle under clause 3.7, which we're not doing, upon subdivision, clause 3.8, which we're not doing, or if a land use consent is sought, which is clause 3.9, which is not being sought. So my conclusion is that the NPS highly productive land is not engaged for this particular request. Now that's run through reasonably quickly.
Yeah, no, but I follow that and don't disagree with that conclusion. I think as you take me through that, I don't see any point at which I think that NPS HPL is engaged for overlay of this precinct, which is essentially seeking to retain a rural zoning.
Exactly, yeah. All right, now thanks for that. So, okay, that's all. And my second question was to ask you for a consolidated suite of provisions that might give effect to the precinct now sought, which you tabled, so that's helpful. And an electronic version of that would be great.
Certainly.
All right, but other than that, no further questions arising from the legal submissions.
Thank you. So I think if we go to Mr. Ford first, whether you have any questions for him.
If we have questions, did you have questions for Stuart Ford? Andrew, Nicole, did you? No, we have no questions for Mr. Ford.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Leckie on transport issues. He hasn't prepared a summary, so it's just whether you have any questions for him.
Questions on transport, Andrew? Nicole? No, we have no questions for Mr. Leckie.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Questions for Mr. Thompson, planning matters, Andrew?
Thank you. So I do have
Sorry, Andrew, before you, Mr. Thompson, did you want to say anything by way of summary or key points before we go to questions for you?
No, actually, I'll just go straight to questions. Thanks.
Right, so Raymond, I checked with you, didn't I? And Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thompson, your 5th of August evidence. You refer in paragraph 30 to existing rural businesses that are further submitted in support of the Gulf Central submission. I'm just interested, was there any commentary or comment, or has there been engagement with Farm Chief?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
No. I just went through the summary of submissions and recorded those who are in support. As far as I'm aware, there's been no consultation with those landowners. That in previous consents referred to here by in original submission, Ms. Aston may have, but I haven't.
Okay, sure. And then just in relation to your rebuttal evidence dated 24th of February.
Yeah.
And also the officer's memo dated 10th of March, which, have you seen that memo from council officer dated 10th of March?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm just interested in the commentary in there around the transport suggestions, and whether you have a view on those as being appropriate to the site. Are they, maybe they're in here?
So this is 4.21
Let's just check.
rebuttal.
Let's just check that. Well, no, it's just in relation to your rebuttal as the latest piece of evidence, and I'm just interested if you'd seen the officer's comments in the 10th of March.
I've only
memo, and yes,
only the transport peer review.
okay, just trying to find that now.
Oh, yeah. This testing.
I think it just, she just refers to, from a traffic perspective, council's expert, Mr. Collins, has said proposals to proceed. There are some traffic concerns, and they should include, and there's a couple of planning mechanism suggestions in there.
Yes.
Yeah, so do you have a comment on those?
Well, no, I'd rather leave that to Mr. Leckie, but from an overall planning perspective, in terms of the access and egress and the traffic effects, the actual precinct has been designed to mitigate those effects by limiting, as far as we can, the scale and intensity of the development, and therefore the types of trips, particularly the heavy vehicle trips, which Mr. Leckie and Mr. Collins both commented on. And so I think the integration between transport and land use here is quite important. But I think the details around how that's handled is Mr. Leckie will comment on that, I think.
I think I can see in your amendments, there's a reference to the fencing as a rule, which looks like it's been incorporated in here. The other one may well be incorporated, I'm not sure, so I just seen this.
Yes, so that captures the roundabout, although I understand that is actually already in place, so it might be unnecessary to have that in there. The median, and then the retention of sightlines through that triangular area.
So thank you. It looks like you have captured that.
Yes, and the rule. Yes, we have.
Thank you. That was my question.
Yeah.
No further questions. Thank you.
And Nicole. So Ms. Everly, what I might do is get our section 42A reporting officer to look at these provisions And if, Jessica, if you have any issues, if you could liaise with Mr. Thompson on that and just let us know whether or not, from your perspective, should we be minded to grant this request now before us, whether or not these provisions, if you have any issues with them, and if you do have issues, could you discuss them with Mr. Thompson and then come back to us with either agree to disagree or a resolution of any issues where there's disagreement. So Mr. Thompson, assume you'd be happy to engage in that process if necessary.
Of course.
All right. But other than that, no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next submitter on our list is the Paul Coburn Family Trust and Helen Coburn Family Trust, and two procedural matters just before we proceed with that. Commissioner Nicole Reid has recused herself from this particular submission because she is friends with one of the parties relating to this submission. And just for the record, Councillor John Hardy and I were both on a ministerial working party that Minister Parker appointed towards the end of last year to look at the new National and Built Environments Act and the Spatial Planning Act and report back to him on efficiency issues. But in my mind, that does not generate a conflict of interest in terms of me hearing this submission. And I confirm that neither Mr. Hardy nor I, we have not discussed this matter at all. So just to record that for the record. So now, other than that, good morning and welcome, and Mr. Hardy, over to you.
And you'll see, sir, there are no legal submissions. Isn't that a whoopity-doo from a lawyer? And I think it would be helpful if I started by just letting you know that the Coburn family have been long-term landowners on the industrial, what I'm going to call it the industrial side now, because the land that they farmed isn't really, this is the last piece of it. They're not developers, they just were farmers, and their land became necessary for other purposes. I'd like to introduce them. I've got two generations, and if I've got Mrs. Coburn and Mr. Coburn from the older generation right there beside my instructing solicitor, and then Paul and his wife, who were the younger generation, are here. And this is the last, hopefully, time they'll need to appear before any council panel in relation to their land, which of course you'll know in 2012 was anticipated as being suitable for uses which are other than farming. So we've not had an argument. This has never been a case about legal submissions that I could find. I think the council officer says it's a case about my having failed to prepare the case properly, because this is what happened. Knowing this land had been suitable, it just required some refinement of the evidence as to how it would proceed. I set about with the experts that had been gathered to go and talk with the council and have conversations, and I thought wrongly that everything was in order, and it wasn't until I got Jessica's report that it was a bit of a shock that I realized that the council thought that more evidence was needed. Now, I could have argued about some of it, but the reality of life is it was important that we just got on with it. We got 2012, we've got to move this thing forward. And so we did our best to get out and provide all of the evidence that she thought was missing. And I suppose really I'm at a point before you, the three of you now today, saying, well, she's reported back in her memo of 10 March, and she says that all of the matters that were of concern that she raised in her primary report have now been satisfied except for 2, and she deals with that in her paragraph 3.5, and in that she says, she makes this statement: the following documents included in the submitter's rebuttal are considered to be new evidence and have not been peer reviewed, and that relates to infrastructure servicing and landscaping. Now, I suppose there is technically a legal issue whether it's new evidence. I don't think it is. What we're trying to do is get to an end point, and I wanted to make sure that she got the evidence that she needed to make her feel comfortable in recommending to you that this was suitable. So you just didn't hear from my witnesses. At any rate, I think the guts of what I read there is that 2 reports haven't been peer reviewed, and she's therefore not prepared to say right at the moment, yes. I think I'm summarizing that correctly. Now, one of those is to do with landscaping, and the other to do with infrastructure servicing. Now, I have all of the witnesses today, including the witnesses who in this report she now says she's happy with, so they're here to answer questions. But I rather think, and knowing you said that you rather like to get on with it and get to the nub of it. So I think probably the best way forward is for you to tell me which of the other witnesses any of your commissioners might wish to talk to, and I'll keep them here. And if possibly you don't want to talk to those other witnesses, I might try and save the Coburn's a small amount of money and send them home.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. I'm happy to do that. So just keep. So just a minute, Mr. Hardy. So now just for the benefit of anyone who's watching on YouTube, we've just canvassed amongst the panel which witnesses we may have questions for. We have no questions for Andrew Metherell, Farius Selwyn. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong, nor for the landscape or civil technical experts. And we've asked Mr. Crystal and Mr. Clark to remain because we may have questions for them.
I suppose the answer is to get Mr. Clark here. Oh, I'm sorry. That's it's a black mark against us. We've wrecked some of the furniture in the room. You'll have to turn that on when it comes.
So, Mr. Clark, good morning, welcome. Thank you very much for your pre-circulated evidence. Is there anything you wish to add or any key points you'd like to bring to our attention before we see if we have questions for you?
No, I think what I've put is the situation, and if anything, I would say the supply has probably decreased over the last 12 months. I don't have anything further to add.
Raymond, questions, Mr. Clark, Andrew?
I do have a question, Pete, against your paragraph 11, but it may be better answered by someone else. And it's just you talk about freehold land being available for purchase and the lack thereof of that, as opposed to design and build options and leasehold land. And I'm just interested in what certainty is there that this land subject to this submission will be, I guess, available for freehold purchase. And it may not be you that can answer that question, but it is, you did cover that in your evidence.
Look, I think it's a good question. I think realistically, you would expect if land became on as available for supply, that there would be some of that would be freehold and available to be developed by individual occupiers.
So there's an expectation basically that some of it might be available to be and sold as freehold, but there's no, you don't have any indication yourself as to whether that will occur in terms of the aspirations of the developer or the owners.
Well, the land is until we know who the purchaser is, but the expectation would be that someone would. I don't have a person who is buying the land. It's not on the market.
Sure. So basically, it's the intention of the owners to sell it, not develop it themselves. That's what you're saying.
I think you'd need to just check with them that
Okay.
is a situation.
Sure. No, thank you. No further questions.
Do you mind if I jump in on that as well? I don't think
ahead.
there is any mechanism to actually ensure what we're discussing here. I think the point that we were trying to make through the evidence, and we've done this previously at previous hearings, is that there needs to be a bit of mix of both in order to satisfy the demand. But I don't know that there's any mechanism to actually achieve either of those two outcomes, to be honest.
So, Mr. Clark, the key issue outstanding in my mind is a matter of demand for additional industrial zone land in the context of Plan Change 80 having been approved by Commissioner Caldwell. And staff, do we know, has it gone to council yet? Has it been adopted? So it's a council adopted decision now to rezone the PC80 land, which brings into play an extra 98 hectares of industrial land. So the question in my mind, given that that's the case, is there a need for this proposal currently in front of us in terms of meeting short, medium or long-term demand?
Look, I think what you would find is that you've got occupiers in that area of Hoskins Road that know the area. And so if there was land available, they would have existing businesses that would be operating out of that location. And so I think you would find that there would be demand for people that are already operating in that location, and they would want to retain efficiency through their business to stay in that area. To be honest, I think that would most definitely provide demand. And you've got a situation where I guess you would have competitive tension in the market as far as what is available. So I think there would be demand, because that's people generally like to stick with the area that they have, and that I think that, as I say, efficiencies and the location would provide that.
In terms of that and the existing operators in that Hoskins Road area, do you have any direct evidence from those current operators that they would be interested in this additional land?
Look, there are some businesses there that are expanding and it would make sense for them to remain in that location. Absolutely.
That wasn't my question. My question was, do you have any direct evidence from those operators themselves that they'd be interested in this additional land?
Direct evidence.
For example, have any of those operators that you are referring to approached you or any of your colleagues about acquiring land in this area and this request that we're now looking at?
I don't directly have evidence from those operators.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clark. No further questions. Crystal. So again, I think you've appeared before us. Thank you for your evidence. We've read that. And you, of course, are very welcome to highlight key points or present a summary for us, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
I'll probably just touch on a couple of things. Firstly, just in response to that question you've just asked, obviously, council had before it, but not before this panel, which we have referred to the evidence of Dr. Foy regarding PC80, which indicated that this land was also needed as part of the industrial growth development. And obviously this land has already been identified as an urban growth overlay in any event. So I just put that to you as well. The only other issue to raise before you, I think, is there's a couple of rules. That's why we've kept Mr. Medrell here. There is a couple of rules proposed by the council traffic engineer, which and I might get Mr. Medrell to come up and address those, but that we probably do need a little bit of discussion over. So that's the Walkers Road roundabout issue. And the other one is the link through to Detroit Drive. And perhaps if I just touch on that one briefly. So the council's wanting a rule requiring a link into Detroit Drive. We've shown it on the ODP that we've proposed. There are some difficulties there enforcing that through a rule rather than dealing with it in subdivision. One being that the council has a 5 metre strip between the two blocks of land, which is essentially an easement in their favour. So you could end up in a situation if you force a rule through there, which that frustrates the ability to meet that requirement. So I'm just put that out there. In my view, that one could be dealt through subdivision rather than actually a rule in that plan. But I think Mr. Metherall it'd be good to sort of canvass that issue around Walkers Road with him.
Just on that Detroit Drive issue, so you're saying that that can be indicated as a link in the ODP, but there's no need for a rule requiring it.
Yeah.
And it might be best for yourself or your transport expert to describe this Walkers Road,
I'll leave that to Mr. Metherall.
Road roundabout.
Good morning. In my evidence in chief, I had a plan of the Waka Kotahi's planned improvements for Rolleston access. I'll just find the picture. So it was my figure 6 on page 18 of my evidence in chief. And it sort of shows the overall plan that Waka Kotahi have for access in and out of Rolleston, including the industrial area. And right at the western end is Duns Crossing Road and Walkers Road. And their plan has a roundabout at that location. And closer to this site close to Hoskins Road, but currently just offset, they have a plan for an overbridge. And our proposed rule restricts development until such time as that overbridge is in, and that was on the basis of the previous plan change 66 had the comparable rule. Mr. Collins has referenced plan change 80, which you've just mentioned, which is much closer to that Walkers Road roundabout. And so that plan change 80 only had the restriction on that roundabout, even though there's quite a bit of extra traffic planned to go back down through Jones Road and Hoskins Road. So I've looked at where traffic has been forecast to go from this area, and in the transport model that the Selwyn Council provided, it was expected approximately 5% of the generated traffic would go through that roundabout, and that equates to around about sort of 10 vehicles per hour. So in terms of sort of the overall traffic volumes in this area, it's my opinion that it's insignificant, and the overbridge requirement that's already in there is clearly already quite onerous, and it's been picked up from those previous plan changes, recognising that there's some constraints in that area. So that's sort of why I've recommended that the Walkers Road roundabout shouldn't be the constraint.
So just clarify that, so you're saying there's, in your mind, from a traffic perspective, there's no need for a condition precedent, to use a phrase, regarding the Walkers Road roundabout, but the one with Hoskins Road overbridge would remain?
So in my rebuttal evidence, I set out that we basically don't have enough information to say to what extent that interchange could accommodate, the intersection that's currently a signalised intersection could accommodate more traffic. But previous decisions had acknowledged, that there was an issue, and the non-compliant rule approach was taken, and so we picked that up and went forward. But to have sort of both intersections as a sort of under that same rule would certainly be onerous. But yeah, plan change 80 didn't include it. So I mean, and that interchange, the overbridge has been pushed out sort of at least 3 to 5 years, which is slightly concerning for the current planning period, I suppose.
Yep. So from a traffic perspective, is your recommendation to include a condition precedent relating to that Hoskins Road overbridge or not? I'm not quite clear what you're telling us.
Look, I've already recommended that in my evidence. So yeah, but it's based on the information or the modelling that we did at the time, which was looking further into the future.
Okay.
And so it's sort of being like risk averse, I guess.
Okay. So that one remains, but in your view, the Walker Road roundabout condition precedent can go.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So, Mr. Crystal, do you wish to say anything else, or should we go to questions?
Yeah,
agree with you. Or so many witnesses, Mr. Metherall, isn't it? We'll see if we have questions for either of you. Raymond, question.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out that Mr. Chris, I did find your evidence very clear and concise, so thank you for that.
Yep, and I have no further questions, and I'd echo that. And it was a very clear brief of evidence, the way you addressed the issues and walked us through them. So thank you. Certainly in my mind, the only issue that I need to give some further thought to is just that demand issue. So, but other than that, thanks very much for coming in this morning.
Can I just make one point about demand, of course, because
yeah, of course. If you want to say anything else by way of summing up, you're welcome to.
It's interesting, of course, when you talk about demand, but demand comes from the fact that land is needed, and I think the primary hopeful point here is that there might be, as you heard, the Cobins, just to make clear to you, Commissioner Wills, that the Cobins are definitely not developers there. So I tried to introduce at the start, it's not an evidence as such, but I wanted you to know that they're just farming people who will have to sell this land on to someone who's suitably equipped to take the thing further. And we just got to hope that it's not the same entity that owns all the industrial land over there, because that way it is very much controlled. But if you do get different entities owning industrial land, it opens up the concept of competition. But I think the bigger picture is that you have to say, if this was not done because of current demand, which at least the evidence of Dr. Foy seems to suggest otherwise, then of course the family would be left with a little hunk of land sitting there, which is not available for any rural activity that could generate income for them. So you do come back to the fact that way back in 2012, someone recognized that that this land was suitable and should be used for that. Yes, it's kind of been gazumped by the fact that some people have got in and brought plan changes along, but I don't think it should derail what the council's intent was as far back as 2012, because the family has really been in limbo since that time. I think that's all I wanted to say, unless you had some further questions of me or any of the other people who haven't left.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just any further questions, Andrew? No, thank you, Mr. Hardy. I think that sums up the case nicely for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so now we're adjourned, unfortunately, until 1:45. Right, good afternoon and welcome. We resume the hearings, number 30.8, rezoning submissions in Eastern Selwyn Commercial and Industrial Area. And at this stage, we're hearing from what I might just call the Carter Group. That's all right. Good afternoon and welcome. I just want to confirm the requests that you're here to talk to us about today. So the large format retail zone in Rolleston,
Yep.
the PC 69 site, the PC 60 site in Hoskins Road, and then the PC 80 site in Two Chain Road.
That's correct. Yeah.
Those four?
Those four. Yep.
Yep. And now thanks very much also for the pre-circulated material on all of those and the liaison that you've undertaken with the district council staff on our behalf. And then also your email confirmation that in terms of should we be minded to accept all of those rezoning requests, that the provisions that were in the 42A addendum cover everything that needs to be covered.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess if I was to add anything, it would just be to note that we're all in agreement with the Section 42A officer. And I understood that there were very few questions from the panel today, but we thought we'd make an appearance just in case anything arose. And yeah.
That's exactly right. So I just asked if the hearing secretary could just ask you to come in just in case we did have any residual matters that we could put to you. So are you happy if we just see if we do have any questions? Or?
Go for it.
Yep,
Thank you.
I think there's been a lot of material circulated, which has covered a lot of stuff.
I do have a question.
Yep.
Everyone knows now, and then
Yep. Yeah, so I understand there's been quite a few conversations between Mr. Phillips and the reporting officer regarding the kind of ins and outs of that rule. I probably couldn't answer them off the top of my head, but I'm more than happy to kind of get Mr. Phillips to provide a more detailed explanation as to the ins and outs of how that rule would work. Yeah.
Lots and this is when lots of sheep died, so I don't lots of sheep walk.
Yeah.
The structure of
yeah.
Not.
Yeah, we can come back to you on that point unless Ms. Churleaper had something to say about that, but yeah.
I would also need to think about it, so I will get back to you.
So just the issue there is what's the starting presumption if it defaults to discretionary?
Yeah.
If capital A, little a and B aren't met as the starting point. It's either permitted activity or controlled or
something
RDs.
else.
Which one
Yep.
is it? Imagine the starting point might very well be a permitted activity, but we'll wait to hear back from you. On
Yeah,
that.
it could well be. I wonder if it's something to do with compliance with the ODP, but I'll get Mr. Phillips to confirm.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question.
Yes, paragraph 8.1.
Yep.
And I'm just interested in the site is by construction down. How does it?
So my understanding is that the CRPS layer of growth will go. So they the map A is essentially what we're talking about here. Identified new greenfield business and residential areas, and then it kind of identifies like a further boundary, which is the projected infrastructure boundary, which suggests that that is where further growth will go, not yet, but in the future. So I suspect that's written in the CRPS somewhere. I wouldn't have it off the top of my head, but that is certainly how that was treated at the PC 66 hearing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a look at the RPS and did a bit of a word search trying to find infrastructure boundary and how it might be defined or referred to, and I could really only find it on map A.
Yeah.
And looking at it, it looks like it's a projected infrastructure boundary, not a predicted urban growth overlay. That was all. So I was interested,
Yeah, I guess we were making the analogy that map A is indicating that this area could be serviced for development later on. So and that in itself is almost an indication that that area is appropriate for development some point in the future. Obviously it's not identified in map A, but yeah.
So it's basically simply that identification has led you to believe that it might be.
That is our submission, yes.
Urban. Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Just should we see if Ms. Seaton has a view on that question? Ms. Seaton, can you hear us?
Yeah, so it's a bit, I missed most of what the first set of the questions is, but I think I've caught up on it now. I generally agree with what Lucy has just said. It's if I'm understanding the question, that the infrastructure boundary isn't particularly well defined other than a map A, but it has been treated as an anticipated extent of development within different parts of the region. Was that the question? Sorry.
Yes, you've covered it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Nicole, any questions? And I have no further questions either, but thanks very much for coming in and for coming in earlier and all of the work that's been done between yourselves and the reporting officers leading up till now.
Great, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of the hearing from submitters. So at this stage of the hearing, because we're not receiving formal reply reports from the reporting officers, what I do now is ask our reporting officer if there's anything that she wishes to address us on, and in particular, if anything she's heard during the hearing has led her to change any of her recommendations to us.
Thank you. At this stage, I probably still sitting with where my recommendations were before the start of the hearing. I would still have a question about the application of the NPS HPL over certain sites. And that's all.
All right, thank you very much for that. Well, that brings us to the end of today's hearings. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.